So there's been a very large-scale privatization, reconstruction of what had been public goods, openly accessible goods, as private property, and an organization of markets, extending into extremely complex markets. This is based, as I suggested, on a long ideological campaign, and it informs not just what has gone on with the richer states' internal operations, that is, the hollowing out of the US state, or now the British state, but with the long-standing consensus advice given to developing countries, the so-called Washington Consensus, which I'm happy to say is no longer a consensus and is breaking up. But this was an idea, for example, that countries would develop best by relying on free trade, as free trade was defined by the United States and by the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and then the World Trade Organization. And here the notion of free trade meant only one kind of freedom, a reduction in government regulation and influence, a reduction in government role in economic nationalism, that is, for example, protectionist trade policies that would defend national interests in relation to both dumping or the predatory low-price potential imports from other countries, but also in relation to investment, attempting to build up firms, so Embraer and other kinds of national champion firms depended on it. Now, in fact, this embodies, to a certain extent, a claim by the rich countries of the world that other countries should do what they say and not what they themselves did. Or as the economist, the Korean economist now at Cambridge, Ha-Joon Chang, puts it, it is advice to kick away the latter. When the United States was competing against Britain for a larger economic role in the world, it used protectionist tariff policies. It used policies of agricultural and industrial subsidies, protection, to build up American industries and become a stronger player internationally. It used, as part of its ladder to development, economic nationalism. But the advice it gives now is that economic nationalism should be forbidden, that it is contrary to the best thinking of leading economists, that it is scientifically unsound, that it is almost morally wrong to have any kind of economic nationalism, because free trade, right, freedom and development seem to come together in a flow of goods and money across borders. Not people. You'll notice the United States is more restrictive on that front. Now, this gets extended to ideas of global society in various ways, as the notion that there's a global civil society rises, but with a considerable ambiguity about whether global civil society, which is celebrated by many liberals and many on the left, is actually complicit with markets, is actually deeply embedded in the spread of global markets, including financial markets, and the relations, again, among our three different notions of civil society, markets, voluntary organizations, and public discourse, or the capacity to influence states, take very different characters. There is no global state. So to call for a reduction in state power is actually to undercut the capacity of global movements to enlist political backing, the backing of various states, for any of their proposals, say to regulate global financial markets, or to secure the opportunity to fund pharmaceuticals in some way that is not completely dependent on the profits of big drug companies. States, globally, again, are widely seen as bad, and this is reinforced in the typical thinking of some of the most important good movements of the liberal left in recent years. So the human rights movement, which has done a great deal for social justice and in important ways has been a key force in holding states to account and in trying to promote social justice in the world, conceptualizes human rights in terms of individual bearers of rights, more or less distinct from any cultural or social embeddedness, and conceptualizes states either as simply respecting those rights, enacting treaties and enforcing them, or often as the source of problems. So for an organization like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International, states appear very often as problems. They are part of the problem. They are the source of violations. Now, it has to be kept in mind that states are the only meaningful enforcement mechanisms available for most of these human rights. Public discourse, civil society campaigns can call attention to violations of human rights. If the violators are profit-oriented actors, they can organize boycotts or other means to try to bring pressure to bear. But for the most part, what is really at stake with human rights is changing the behavior of states. A simple decline in state power isn't the issue. The issue is changing whether states are violating human rights, persecuting people, or protecting human rights. Or take again humanitarian action, a phenomenon that I actually studied more empirically. The sending of foreign assistance of some kind or another to places like the Congo when it undergoes a massive crisis. Especially since the end of the Cold War, there has been an increase in the frequency of various kinds of humanitarian crises, especially those occasioned by small-scale wars, by wars that do not involve one state fighting against another state, but involve secessionist movements, but also involve liberation fronts that begin to turn into traders in diamonds or drugs or traffickers in women and lose their original ideological moment. Think of Liberia. Now, whatever else we may say about humanitarianism, part of the experience of the humanitarian workers and part of their culture is a culture of anti-statism, a culture in which the states, again, look like problems. It's hard to say anything good about the Sudanese state, for example, at the moment. Yet, it is impossible to imagine a resolution to the problems in Darfur that didn't involve an effective Sudanese state. Or even more, Congo, which I mentioned a moment ago. There is no imaginable end to the fighting, end to the abuses, end to the violence against women that does not depend on a better Congolese state. So when one speaks simply of the problems with states and the need to reduce state power in favor of civil society, it's important to ask where you're talking about and with what level of organization. Civil society is much more dependent on successful state action in many realms, leading civil society to influence the state or to operate in certain other realms, then it is viable as an alternative to states. So why does anyone get misled into this? Why do we think this, right? Well, partly we have been caught up in this era of neoliberalism in an attractive cultural ideology which I think hides many of the effects of neoliberalism. The cosmopolitan cocktail is not itself responsible. I'm not suggesting a new sociological theory in which alcoholic beverages are the determinant factor of world history, though the parties last night suggest that they are not without influence. The cosmopolitan cocktail is actually a particularly accurate symbol for certain kinds of 1990s excess, not only associated with the American TV show Sex and the City, but two different bartenders claim to have invented the cosmopolitan cocktail, one in New York and one in Silicon Valley. Each of them has had a book-length biography written about him on the basis of his world historical importance as the rival inventor of the cosmopolitan cocktail. Right? So it does symbolize something. Right? Cosmopolitanism in fashion, cosmopolitan is a certain kind of fashion, a certain kind of compliment. Who wants to be called parochial or local? Right? On the contrary, it's good to be cosmopolitan. It's good to know how to pick out an Italian suit. It's good to know about world affairs. It's good to have an idea about musical contributions from all over the world. Right? So cosmopolitanism gets caught up in ideas of fashion. The French economic leader, Messier, who is the head of the ill-fated Vivendi Outer Empire, described himself as pursuing the policy of cosmopolitanism in business and in culture, right? Embracing this notion, right? Which I think many others have embraced without quite such clear use of the words. Right? The magazine Cosmopolitanism is in a sense a trivial example of the Cosmopolitan magazine, but not altogether. It's actually one of the few American magazines that has successfully produced global editions in 28 different languages around the world, making a profit still in this era of difficulties for print publishing. It carries a certain ideology of liberation. Its slogan is fun, fearless, and female. So it embodies one side of the women's movement, but it's actually an old women's movement, we might add, that goes back to the 19th century, and so here in Cosmopolitanism, and it's only one side. Cosmopolitanism was founded in what is called the Gilded Age in America, an era of the great robber barons, huge capitalist fortunes being made by people named things like Rockefeller, not unlike the current era with its huge capitalist fortunes. There was a crash in 1893, right? It managed to survive that, but Cosmopolitan's marketing and its successful sales have tracked economic booms. They went up through the Gilded Age, fell in the 1890s, went up again through the 1920s, fell in the Great Depression, right? This particular vision, right, is a vision of women's emancipation as a lifestyle change. And if you track Cosmopolitanism, the magazine contents, there are a variety of ways in which women are urged to improve their lives, but one is never mentioned: politics. In the women's suffrage movement in the United States, Cosmopolitan magazine never took a stand. And today, it is about being liberated as a woman without any political collective action. In other words, it's very much emblematic of what we might think, what gets called post-feminism, but as the fact that it's been doing it for 130 years suggests, it was always another running path. The non-feminist, yes, I want the lifestyle changes, but no, I don't want the social transformations version of a certain idea. Now here, fashion and finance combine in important ways, and I don't just mean the magazine. Right? So take in India the fact that Cosmopolitan is the first category in newspaper advertisements for husbands seeking wives or wives seeking husbands. There are in the Sunday Times of India pages, several pages of personal ads, right? And many of these personal ads, the first category, right, is cosmopolitan, right? As in smart, westernized, cosmopolitan, working for large multinational corporation, seeks sane, right? Or seeks understanding woman for companionship and possible relationship. Now, there are also pages of advertisements by caste, by religion, by region, and by other factors that come after. But there is a particular elite category being constructed of the cosmopolitan. Cosmopolitan in this context is something that is described as a personal attitude. You are a cosmopolitan or not because of the way you think about things, because of what you value, because of your behavior, because of what gives you gratification. But in fact, this masks the fact that not everyone can afford equally to be cosmopolitan. It is not a choice equally available to everyone. There's a prestige hierarchy and there's a hierarchy of wealth. The president of Singapore made a speech 2 years ago in which he said, in Singapore, our citizens come in two kinds, but they're both equally valuable. We have heartlanders and we have cosmopolitans, and we love them all. They are all part of the great Singapore. Right? The suggestion is that everybody should feel good about being Singaporean. Both those who become part of global society by virtue of the wealth they acquire as middle and upper class Singaporeans, and those who simply work and get very little of that global benefit. I quote here a local blogger, perhaps not coincidentally, not a Chinese Singaporean, but his name is Krishna Swami, Indian Singaporean, who writes in his blog that many Heartlanders think that to become a cosmopolitan, you need a lot of money. Nothing could be further from the truth. Being a cosmo is essentially a state of mind and has nothing to do with that bank overdraft that keeps you up at night. He's being sarcastic, of course. Right? It has everything to do with whether you are worried by your financial situation, whether you can afford to buy a Rolex watch, whether you can afford to travel business class or travel at all, whether you can afford vacations abroad. So yes, there is globalization, absolutely, but there is the illusion that it is somehow the same thing happening everywhere to everyone, that this becoming globally knit together, which does affect Singaporean workers, when there's a downturn in trade, they lose their jobs, gives them the same sort of opportunities it offers the middle and upper class cosmopolitans. I earlier referred to this in an article as the class consciousness of frequent travelers. And most of us are guilty of it. Now, admittedly, most of you have come only from Rio or Sao Paulo or Belo Horizonte, so this doesn't make the same point it would make at a global conference, at the International Political Science Association, the International Sociological Association. But in fact, lots of academics, not all, inhabit an increasingly global space. We go to global conferences. We generally don't go first class. Right? We have to stay in the cheaper hotels, but we go. And so we've been to Gothenburg, or we've been to South Africa, or we've been to New York, right? We travel. And we meet our fellow academics as equals in these other places. We ignore the fact, of course, that the conferences are usually in English, and therefore there's a little bit of hegemony of the global language, which actually reflects power relations. But most of us are polite enough not to mention it most of the time. Most of you, I should say. Right? The cosmopolitan class consciousness of the frequent flyers is like class consciousness of elites much of the time, like bourgeois elites who say, there is freedom in our country. Everybody is free to open a business if they want to. Everybody has the same property rights. Everybody can vote, right? But wish to ignore issues of inequality. Karl Marx made fun of such a version of bourgeois liberalism by saying, yes, and everybody is free to decide which bridge they want to sleep under when they're homeless. Right? There is the illusion of freedom to much elite class consciousness. There is an illusion of not having class consciousness, that is, aristocrats and bourgeois elites feel they speak for the country and not simply for their class. But there's also, with this cosmopolitanism, an illusion of global consciousness. An illusion that having traveled and stayed in hotels like this all over the world, you've actually known what the lives of all people all over the world are like. Having stayed in the Hilton Hotel in New Delhi, and the Hilton Hotel in Singapore, the Hilton Hotel in Johannesburg, and the Hilton Hotel in a variety of other places, however, does not mean that you have experienced the whole world. However, it does mean you're likely to think you have. Right? And having sat next to people from Asia or people from Africa in your business class seat in the airplane and had an enjoyable conversation with them and found that as business executives in Asia, business executives in Latin America, they were able to have much the sort of conversation you could have with business executives at home, right? Reaffirms this sense that the world is much more seamlessly integrated than it really is. There's a tendency for these cosmopolitan frequent travelers to think of culture as something that affects those people back home. Those people in the countries that they have flown away from are limited by culture. They're sort of stuck. They're closed-minded, but the cosmopolitans have escaped. And here I want to suggest is a meeting point between this class consciousness in its broad, usually not very theorized way, and political theory. Because this is also the account of cosmopolitanism that is being offered, say, by Jürgen Habermas, or David Held, or Daniel Archibugi, or a variety of others who are suggesting that the path to a global order that really works is to escape from any thick understanding of culture, any strong sense of local solidarity. Because of the words of Martha Nussbaum, the other American feminist and philosopher, identifying yourself by any strong local source of solidarity, community, religion, or nation, is morally suspicious because it is identification by a morally dubious category. The only morally sound category is humanity as a whole. Now then there are people who would say, what about animals, and shouldn't we expand the category further? But there's also a question of what have we lost if we say that the only forms of solidarity we are going to create are with humanity as a whole, the only morally legitimate identifications with humanity as a whole, and the way to identify with humanity as a whole is, in some sense, to escape from culture, because culture is always particularistic. It's always some particular culture. Well, this is an illusion, right, on several levels, including the fact that it's an illusion for the cosmopolitan frequent travelers to think they have escaped from culture. They may have escaped from some of its influences, but they're probably still influenced by the culture at home. But even more, what they've really done is enter a new culture, right? A culture in which you can have a debate about whether the financial coverage is better in the Financial Times or the Economist, in which you can discuss whether it's better for your children to go to Sciences Po or to Harvard's Kennedy School or the LSE. A debate in which you can discuss whether Chilean red wines really travel as well or aren't the best at home or are the best exported. A debate in which you can discuss a whole series of global issues. Right? In other words, you've entered into the culture of the global class. And you may enter into it with a bit of inferiority. Perhaps you don't know as much about wines, and you aren't able to have a 45-minute discussion on the topic of the influence of terroir versus oenology, right? Like every other field, it has hierarchies. There are people who know more, who learn. There are reasons why the Financial Times has pages on lifestyle and consumption. Not only is this good for advertising, which it is, because the makers of Rolex watches and the marketers of various Scotch whiskies buy space, but it's also part of what it offers members of the cosmopolitan elite class. It offers a kind of training, a learning in how to be a good cosmopolitan, what you need to know about. So academics, right, move in a slightly inferior version of this. Anyone here have a Rolex watch? Right? We tend not to have the most expensive consumer durables, but we tend often to have sort of extensive knowledge, right? And to be able to move into a kind of dominated fraction of the dominant global class, to imitate Bourdieu's terminology. Right? Now, my point isn't that this is all